Morning, everyone, and welcome to our Stormwater Workshop, where we have the privilege to have Jessica Brown here from UGA to talk to us about rain barrels and rain gardens as we continue to tackle our stormwater infrastructure in the city. And this is our part of our education series, and so we are excited to have her here and are very grateful through a seed grant that we have. And so without further ado, Jessica.
Thanks, Eve. Good morning. As was mentioned, my name is Jessica Brown, and I am at the University of Georgia. I'm fortunate to have a unique position within the university. The university values not only research and teaching, but also public service. And so we are part of public service and outreach. And much of the focus of the work is taking some of the science and the research, the innovations that are happening at the university level, and actually getting that out to Georgians. And so today, obviously, the topic will be around stormwater management, and particularly stormwater management that we can do on a more residential landscape. So I thought we'd start talking a little bit more broadly about stormwater and some of the reasons behind why folks are interested in it, particularly kind of the scaling of it. So there's stormwater management that's happening more regionalized basis and then across citywide, and then dive into more of the practices that we can use in our own landscape. And so with that, Eve mentioned, but I certainly wanted to highlight as well the partnership that we are fortunate to have with the city and as part of this educational campaign or workshop series, working closely with their consultant, Goodwin, Mills, and Kaywood, and elevating the awareness and understanding of how these practices fit, not only in your own yard and landscape, but also the infrastructure citywide. So grateful for that, but I always love to kick it off with having everybody think about a time, maybe a memorable time, or maybe just the last time that it rained. So take a second. Don't want to put anybody really on the spot, but thinking about what happens when it rains? Where does the water have a chance to go? Do we think about a whole lot the collection of rainwater? But experiences that folks in the room might have had. Don't make me call on people.
Sometimes they're just puddles in your yard. Just crazy little puddles in your yard.
Puddles. More nuisance puddles or big puddles?
Probably nuisance puddles.
Nuisance puddles. Yeah, nobody likes to get their feet wet, for sure. Well, in providing a little bit more framework, as we've talked about this broadly across Georgia, there's a range of experiences. Everything from more of that nuisance type flooding, or stormwater, getting your shoes wet, having to take a different route, up to more of a social and economic concern with flooding in people's homes, causing life and property loss. So, as I mentioned before, some pretty big scales when we think about the potential impacts. But when using the terminology stormwater, what I'm referencing for that is any of the precipitation, and I joked last night, and I'm going to have to amend it again. In the past, I have just defaulted to rain, particularly in South Georgia. But last week proved us wrong. We also have to consider some of that other precipitation. But any of that doesn't have an opportunity to be absorbed or infiltrated into the ground has the potential to run off, is that quantity of stormwater. And so some of the surfaces when we think about the potential for stormwater include the reference of impervious surfaces. So think roadways, sidewalks, anything, rooftops that doesn't actually allow that water to infiltrate or be absorbed. causing kind of a twofold issue. With that, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I love this slide. It's a little bit busy, so I'm going to try to unpack it a little bit more. But it kind of demonstrates the relationship between what makes up our landscape and how the quantity of stormwater or the potential impact of stormwater. So on the left-hand side of the screen, and laser pointers don't work on TVs, so forgive me for using my hands. But on the left-hand side of the screen, got more of an undeveloped watershed, more of a forested condition, which you might experience. And there's actually quite a bit of that in and around Thomasville, as I have come to learn over the last couple of days. But when we think about what happens to the water when it rains, in that situation, about 40% of it actually returns to the atmosphere through evapotranspiration with plants. About half of it infiltrates back into the ground, and only about 10% of it's running off. But as you can see, and as our eyes are pulled to the arrow left to right, as we change the landscape, we're also changing that water balance or that equation, and the numbers sort of flip. We've got over half of it becoming stormwater runoff, and only about 10% of it making its way into the ground. And, that begs the question, what sort of choices do we want to make, right? Because obviously there's a cause and effect. As we continue to develop or we increase impervious surfaces, we have the potential to have more runoff. But what are the trade-offs, and what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about when we're going to deal with it? And with stormwater, it's sort of twofold. One, which actually is the more sexy, flashy part of stormwater, it's the impact of potential flooding. Road closures, like I said, loss of property, and even in tragic cases, life, or that lack of access to critical infrastructure, not just conveniences. So quantity is one thing that we have to think about when we're thinking about stormwater. But in addition to that, also thinking about what the stormwater has the potential to pick up. And so as it's moving across those surfaces, it is really great at picking up all the non-point source pollutants. So things like pet waste that are heavy in pathogens, or some of the examples there when we casually fertilize those impervious surfaces, potential for nutrient inputs, or metals, oils, and greases, and even some of the more recent research looking at the impacts of heat from those same surfaces. Of course, litter and sediment, some of those usual suspects kind of come into play too. But stormwater becomes a vehicle for all of those pollutants to make their way into the water bodies that surround us. And obviously, that the connection between that pollution and those water bodies, there are impacts for their uses as well. So thinking about fishable, swimmable, drinkable, depending on the level of pollution that's entering them, may actually impact how we utilize them. So really fortunate, there's not as many of these sort of obvious challenges here in the city right offhand, but I do think that there's a lot of opportunity for thought process to be proactive. And so one of the things that's really exciting, here we go, is how do we think about managing the quantity of water or the quality of water? Traditionally, societally, our acceptance for managing stormwater is put it in a pipe, put it in a ditch, move it as quickly and as efficiently away from wherever we are. And that still works for a lot of our stormwater challenges, particularly when we're thinking about quantity. But there has been a fair amount of research in the last 30 to 40 years to show that while that may be helping us on a quantity side, thinking about the quality side of the house and how we're addressing those pollutants, we might need to be a little bit more creative and innovative. And many of the practices that support that treatment are fall under the subset of stormwater green infrastructure. Now, I love it. Somebody asked me last week, why do they call it green infrastructure? Well, a lot of it is vegetated, which I think contributed to the roots of its name. But here are some of the more common practices across Georgia. So bioretention, which is kind of the big sister of one of the practices that we're going to talk about a little bit later, but is shallow landscape depression. We're starting to see a lot more of permeable pavement. This example here is permeable pavers, so they look like standard bricks or pavers, but in between there's actually void space that allows the water to go back in. And you see another example there in the center with the pervious concrete. I really need to figure out how to loop that a little bit more quickly, but the thing that looks like a gray Rice Krispie treat is actually a chunk of pavement that allows the water to actually move back subsurface. Another one of those vegetated practices, a little bit more linear application, is this the bioswale here in the center. And then some of our maybe more obvious forms of detaining water, capturing water, but on a much larger scale with rainwater harvesting and rainwater reuse. So this is a good selection of things that you might actually see in application in a little bit broader scale, kind of more citywide scale. But we're going to switch gears here in a second, because much of the conversation for the series is more of like what we can do in our own landscape. But before we do that, I want to call to attention that not only do these practices have a great environmental benefit, and as I mentioned before, can reduce quantity, but there's a fair amount of research that's also demonstrating their social benefit as well as their economic benefit. So kind of the trend in that research is showing that we as a community enjoy green spaces and planted spaces and spaces that are cooler than, say, some of that more hardened infrastructure that we have. So we get a lot of co-benefits with utilizing these type of practices versus some of the others as well. Before we switch gears completely to more of a residential side of things, questions about general stormwater or things that you've observed with stormwater in the city? Any of that?
The picture you had of the Jekyll Island, the bioswale, what makes that, why is it called that? I mean, what's different about it?
Really good question, actually. So one of the things that you can't see right off the side of this is there was formerly a large detention basin, and just on the other side of this parking lot is the ocean. And so, well, before the ocean, there's a really heavily used bike path and bathroom with changing facility there to access. And so the intention of having this here is because there was some erosion kind of happening on the front side. And the feature that was on the other side was honestly just really not aesthetic at all. And it was collecting a lot of trash from the parking lot. And so looking at opportunities, so instead of sending it all to that large kind of holding structure that needed to have some repair done anyway, is how could we actually use some of the landscape islands? So this was formerly a raised landscape island in the middle, and they simply inverted that and make it to have a little bit more capacity, but it also has a drain underneath. So in the event of a really large storm event, that is all kind of trucking headed back to that kind of bonus storage on the other side. So it, one, it's a little bit more linear, and two, it's kind of used more for that conveyance of water instead of just holding it. Although this one's kind of does both. But yeah, it's I like the picture, one, because I had the opportunity to have some drone footage, which is I think a neat perspective. But the lighter color is actually this pervious concrete. So interestingly enough, this is one of the sites that I've had the opportunity to do some research on, and this particular site has had several storm events, and the only storm event that we have seen that it had water actually standing in the bioswale was a hurricane. Most of the time when it rains, even as much as that parking lot, because of the way it's graded, the water just disappears. So reduces the number of wet feet for folks headed to the beach. But yeah, good question. All right, so switching gears a little bit to think about more of our home landscape. And I'll be honest, I don't think a lot about that even in my own yard until some of those same things are happening. Puddles, trying to get kids in the car, headed to school, and everybody's like stomping through, getting super wet before we head out. But it's really important as we're considering some of these options to observe kind of where the water is going, where it's coming from. And I love this. I did ask permission to use this photograph from a resident that I had a chance to work with, but one of his earlier questions was, I just don't understand why there's this huge puddle at the end of my driveway every time it rains. And so I was like, okay, well, let's go take a look. And sure enough, every single one of his downspouts had a connected piece and this lovely diffuse downspout connection to it. But every single one of them were pointed to another impervious surface, a sidewalk, a driveway. And so sometimes the best solution is not necessarily the most expensive one, but simply redirecting that flow. So one of the first kind of green infrastructure practices that I often encourage folks that have gutters is just this practice of simple disconnection. So within about 30 minutes that afternoon, we flipped all of his downspout diverters. And sure enough, the next week when rainstorm, he was like, that's pretty amazing. We completely eliminated the puddle. And so thinking about those opportunities where impervious surfaces, whether rooftop, sidewalk, driveway, how they're stacked in our own landscape. And so just simply creating that disconnection and running it over a vegetated surface, grass lawn or in some cases, a really pretty planter that happens to be at a school, but a relatively cheap solution. So this is one of the shorter flexible pipe. It run you about $6 at Lowe's or Home Depot. Easy to add to gutter system and kind of redirect. But can do a lot for mitigating just what's coming off the rooftops. So two other practices, a little bit more expensive, but also a little bit more impactful when we're thinking about quantity and quality. But the first of which is a rain barrel. And similar to the simple disconnection, we're really just trying to place that in between those connected impervious surfaces, in this case the house and the street, but really providing some sort of disconnection. between that water just being directly input into the storm sewer system. I thought it was really great, and I actually deleted the slide, so unfortunately there's not a visual for it, but someone reminded us in the workshop last night, one of the things that a lot of folks may not be aware of is all of the storm sewer is not going to the wastewater treatment plant. The storm sewer is, all of that network of pipe is actually moving directly to the nearest water body. So anything that we see in the, that folks like to move toward the street, whether it be water or litter or yard debris, etc., is actually headed to the nearest creek, lake, detention basin. And so providing that disconnection gives us an opportunity not only to reduce the quantity of water, alleviating some of the burden on maybe aging infrastructure, but also gives us a chance to reuse it for alternative uses. I love this rain barrel, and I love it in this graphic because it's flashy and shows up. It's from a rain barrel art project that many years ago, but a lot of them in the wild actually look a little bit more like the one on the right. And I've got several examples kind of stepping through. But the reason I included the photograph on the right is this homeowner took it one step further and added the visual and audible rain chain as an entrance to their rain barrel. Before we get into a little bit of the specifics around rain barrels, I borrowed this slide from my colleague Kelly Hill with the Department of Natural Resources, Coastal Resource Division, and I love it. I think it's pretty powerful because a lot of times one of the first questions I get when talking about rain barrels is, okay, what's that really going to do? But it is a pretty powerful number when thinking about the average household uses just shy of 150,000 gallons of water a year, and almost half of that being water that we use in our landscape, in our yard. And so anytime we can capitalize on quote-unquote free water and reutilize that water in our landscape, we're really doing our part to not only in water conservation, but also participating in that groundwater recharge that we certainly value with the rich water resources that we have in Georgia. And many of the barrels I'm going to show in the photographs are actually more of a standard size, a 55-gallon barrel, but even the smallest one that you can purchase is right around 35. And I had the opportunity to kind of rerun these numbers for the average annual rainfall in Thomasville, and was happy to see a little over 1,000 gallons a year you can capture in a rain barrel, which is not an insignificant amount of water to be reusing. But a couple of different types of systems, a couple of different visuals for folks that might be interested in rain barrels. You can have an opportunity for more of a prefab version. Many of them are made out of very stable plastics. Some which we're actually exploring opportunities for ones in Thomasville that are more recycled, like food grade level of plastic, so they're a lot thicker. But even the ones that are commercially available, a lot of them are made out of plastics. You can also see them out of wood or metal. The wood ones tend to degrade a lot faster just due to water storage, but I found a lot of people like to make theirs look like those, so that one in the middle is actually at a cooperative extension office. They painted it to look like a wooden barrel, but that is an open top system, which I realized the photograph does not really do that too much justice because you can't actually see the top. But you'll have to take my word for it. That has some holes in the top as well as the screen over. And in that situation, there's not a gutter present. So we can still capture rainwater. That's a corner unit. very effective using the open top system. And then one that's maybe a little bit more commonly represented in the photographs, and one that a lot of folks like is this closed diverter system, which is a great opportunity if you do have gutters to kind of limit limit some of the more routine maintenance, particularly in the topic of mosquito prevention. So a few different types of setups, and you can see also, a few more photographs. You can see several of them actually have these platforms, or they're raised so that you can actually get a watering can, or in many cases, even if they're hooked up to a hose, they're raised to kind of increase the pressure in that barrel. Because, of course, one of the most important things is to actually use the water in the barrel, which may be one of the grander challenges. A lot of the examples you can see, I'm trending toward a lot of the more aesthetic and painted, fun-looking barrels. Not all of the ones in the wild are quite so creative, but I think that is another opportunity for folks to kind of personalize it and make it their own. Some of the typical uses for a rain barrel, because as mentioned, we certainly don't want to just leave that full and overflowing, creating unwanted habitat, but lots of different uses in the yard. One of the questions, or a popular question, is there any concern for using rainwater in vegetable gardens or things around things? And there's quite a bit of research showing that we don't, unless you're spraying a mossicide or some sort of herbicide on your rooftop, the rainwater is actually much more pleasing to our plants, including vegetables. But lots of uses in and around the home. My favorite, and the one that I employ, is actually the lazy drip method, because then I don't have to worry about remembering to empty that before the next storm. Not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about it today, so if it does pique your interest, I encourage you to make sure to sign up for future opportunities with building rain barrels and learning more about the specifics. But I do want to take advantage of the chance to mention that, just like all of the other practices, thinking about how that performs in your own landscape, where it might be most convenient for that spigot to go, or having that on the opposite side of the house of your garden and that's your intended use, certainly be thinking about those uses and how it might be most functional as a tool. I think that's the last of kind of teasers for rain barrels today, but in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the last sort of residential practice, which happens to be one of my favorite rain gardens. And a rain garden is simply a shallow landscape depression. So think of, a lot of times with children, I use the reference of bathtubs, because everybody has seen a bathtub, but some sort of bowl-shaped structure that allows us to capture and store and then slowly soak in that water over time and to get it back into the ground. Just like the other practices, we're looking to try to intercept that connected impervious, so kind of in between. And one of the many things, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the benefits, but one of the things that folks love about rain gardens is they can be really pretty too. Not that I feel like it's much of an advantage, but part of some research a few years ago just goes to show how well they can be integrated into the landscape, with the exception of the 5 neighbors that knew about the construction of that particular rain garden. There were literally hundreds of people walking by to access the local park that had no idea that even had any function, that it was just a pretty porch. down the street. So definitely something that can be easily integrated, providing a whole host of benefits. And so I highlighted the runoff and the groundwater recharge earlier, but they can be very pretty. They can also be a very cost-effective way to manage water in your own yard, and they provide a whole host of ecological benefits in terms of habitat for pollinators, habitat for birds, all sorts of beneficial uses, or ecological uses. They can be very biodiverse and pretty. Some of the other resources that I would call attention to, even when first kind of thinking about rain gardens, and there again, as part of this series, there'll be an opportunity to kind of dive a little bit deeper, but things to consider initially, and there's some really great resources through UGA Extension and colleagues and partners there, but thinking about the proximity of utilities, power lines, how close, because these are intended to store water, how close we want them toward existing structures, but also that consideration of where it's going to be in your landscape and where water moves. And so locating these in places that are not already ponded or wet, but in a way that we might actually redirect water. One of the things that's really helpful when thinking about them is also to know something about the soil and its ability to infiltrate the water into the ground. So I mentioned like not putting them somewhere wet, and I point to Extension. There's lots of great resources with local extension, so Thomas County Extension, with providing a soil sample, knowing what's there, what sort of amendments might be needed. There's also a whole host of online resources that we'll get a little bit more into as far as like individual design, but many things to consider. And then one of the things that I always want to call attention to is we are actually designing the feature. So while it appears very simple and just a creative addition to the landscape, we do have some intentionality with sizing it appropriately and making sure that it can capture the amount of water that we're actually seeing from the source. And so that's not, we're fortunate in that we have some resources that make that math a little bit easier for us, but understanding what sort of square footage that we're capturing water from and sizing it appropriately is an important consideration. And as I mentioned before, there will be opportunities in future parts of the education series to really get into the specifics of that. But just because there's lots of folks that are curious, not only the footprint, but what that depression actually looks like, and kind of more of a cross-section. Got some graphics that show that a little bit better. But oftentimes, there again, we're trying to capture runoff from rooftops or driveways, rerouting it into this depression that has multiple layers, but yeah, just a little different look. How are we doing on time? Okay. So a few last minute things to mention before there again opening it up for questions. But one of the things that we really encourage across Georgia when considering these practices too is encouraging the use of native plants. Certainly not mandatory. We see a lot of commercial ornamentals that do well, but many of our natives are already adapted to our conditions, and speaking of adapted to drought and rainfall conditions that make them a little bit more suited in placement or in the different, the varying levels, but they're also a little bit more efficient in terms of pollutant removal in our local landscape. So there again, lots of co-benefits between the ecological and the design aspects of rain gardens. So just to highlight that further, something like the cardinal flower is going to be much happier in kind of the base in that zone one condition, whereas the Rudbeckia, the yellow one, is actually going to be much happier kind of up on the edges and not having so much of like wet feet. And where we can have lots of texture interest with grasses and some of the smaller like clumping things, something as pretty as the beautyberry is going to get a lot larger, and kind of thinking about where it might go, not only visually, but where it might thrive, even though these are pretty small systems. There again, there are going to be plenty of options to talk about some of those design details in follow-up workshops. But just some things to be thinking about as you're planning about it. And maybe one of the most overlooked is that these are constructed practices in your yard. And so a lot of times folks are asking, is this something I can do myself? Sure. Able-bodied folks can bring everybody together, construct one in the middle of halftime, have it dug out, planted on Saturday. Certainly make it a fun project as far as a community effort, but there's also a variety of commercial landscapers that are starting to become a little bit more interested and offering this type of service as well. So I have already alluded to it, but before we kind of wrapped up completely, I wanted to mention that there are some follow-up opportunities, and we've got some sign-ups for that. So in February, we're going to be offering a workshop to get a little bit more involved in the design. And so if this is something that you're really interested in your landscape, or if you're sitting here thinking, I might want a rain barrel, but my neighbor really needs a rain garden, take advantage of that offering. The February workshops are going to be more one-on-one design and looking at the sizing and the plant selection for those individual applications. And then there's also a sign up in the back of the room for some future opportunities with regards to rain barrels, opportunities to build rain barrels, opportunities to look at how that might show up in the city. So I encourage you to take a look at what some of those offerings, and then also stay connected with city announcements for educational opportunities coming up. And with that, I would be very honored if you would take just a few minutes. I promise it's not long, but there's a QR code to it here in the packet. There's also a printed copy if you prefer that, but give us a little bit of feedback about workshop today, as well as a chance to connect for some of those other opportunities coming up. Questions?
Do it for mosquito control and rain barrels?
I do. My most favorite and cost-effective option, that's also very environmentally friendly, is the standard brand of vegetable oil at your local grocery store. A capful in the top breaks the surface tension and doesn't actually allow breeding. It's very cost-effective, and I love it because it's usually there, and I just dump a capful on the top.
How often do you need to do it?
It depends on how quickly it drains down. It's for me, it's like whenever I remember it up in the yard every couple of weeks. Yeah, I mean, if you're doing it like even once a month, that'll probably do a pretty good job. I find that I tend to do it more often in the summertime when we have more rain and the barrel's getting used a little bit more frequently. I'm fortunate because in South Georgia we can have a rain barrel year round. In other parts of the world you do have to actually like clean them out and store them and winterize them. And so some folks prefer during those heavy seasons to use commercially available mosquito dunks which you can buy like a 6-pack. Okay. At Home Depot or Lowe's.
So at what point do you need to worry about the water I drained ours last week because we had below freezing for so long.
That was a really smart move on your part. I know that there are some folks that didn't, and theirs fared okay with just a few days of lower temperatures, but yeah, it certainly doesn't hurt to. I also use that as a great opportunity to clean mine out and get the stuff that's out of it, with occasionally draining it for winter, but most of the time we can see 3 to 5 days of something that's hovering right around freezing and not have to worry about it, but always better to be safe than sorry. I tell folks, particularly with there's like painted barrels and something that's really pretty, then go ahead and start to think about winterizing those kind of early December, at least until we get out of the winter scaries in February. But yeah, so far, and I think a lot of it too also depends on position, and like in your yard. Mine gets a lot of sun, so don't worry about it too as much. So, other questions, comments, impassioned speeches, lunchtime desires?
Requiring planting trees when building parking lots.
That can certainly make a big difference, both in shade and in water. Well, thank you so much for spending time with me this morning, and encourage you to check out some of the resources in the back.